Welcome to the Salience Podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
Judy was named as a top 100 influencer in remote working in 2020 by Onalytica. With Steve McCann, she is the co-founder of ReesMcCann, a boutique training company specialising on making online gatherings better than in the room. Better than in the room is a big claim. And I agree, when that happens, we create so many opportunities for different ways of working. Judy has written several books on the use of metaphor for change at work and throughout life. She's one of those people whose work I've followed for many years. And as we started doing virtual facilitations in 2020, it was great to see Judy's work coming to the fore. Many of our clients at Frontline Mind report that they both love and hate remote work. They like the autonomy and they struggle with the lack of connection and Zoom fatigue. So this interview is going to be about the fundamentals of connection, engagement and teamwork and how they can be enabled in remote or hybrid ways. Welcome, Judy.
Hello, great to be here.
Well, I want to fire straight into the heart of the topic. This idea of connections and relationships, teaming and teamwork. You know, you didn't just land in this niche you've created. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back a little bit before. Now, what happened before, a little bit more about your own journey, long before you created this niche and recognized the need in this particular area.
Okay. I've got a strong preference for remote working, not least because... So I'm just back from facilitating a 3-day residential for a team, the away day near Paris. And for me, that's really, really hard work. Not just because the work, not at all because the work of running an away day is hard work. It's a joy, but because I find it really difficult to be surrounded by people all the time. I just wish I could switch them off and have a few minutes to myself to gather my thoughts before diving back in again. And that's the joy that working remotely has given me for the last scary number of years, maybe 15 years. And even in the early part of my career, I was doing remote work in that I was a journalist. So it's always been the case that news journalists have worked autonomously and away from their central office a lot of the time.
What sort of skills or experiences, perhaps even from your early life, act perhaps as a backdrop to how you do what you do now? I'm actually looking for tipping points. Sometimes something happens early in life and you go, you know what, that was actually relevant. I use it now. Happened when I was 10 or 15 or 20. But you know what, that's shaped who I am.
One of the most important ones that I often mention is that when I was a teenager, my father was studying the role of metaphor in communication. He wrote a master's thesis on it. And that meant, of course, that the books that were on our family shelves included Metaphors We Live By Lakoff and Johnson. Now, some of the listeners will have read that book. They will certainly know about some of the things that came out of that book, a real understanding that metaphor is not just a frill on the top of clever writing. Metaphor is the very stuff of thought, the native language of the unconscious mind. We talk in metaphors at the rate of about six metaphors a minute because we think in metaphor. We think by combining one kind of thing to another kind of thing. And knowing that very early in my life gave me a big advantage. Not only when I went into journalism, but also later when I got into clean language and understanding how people communicate. I also, in that same period, had an early experience of early NLP learned from books, because my dad actually had the 3 earliest NLP books in the house. He later gave them to me. But I didn't read those. They were impossible. I don't know whether you've ever read those books, but they are impossible to read. They're transcripts of conversations with really poor punctuation. But my dad got hold of them and was experimenting with them on us as teenagers. So by the time I started learning NLP, probably it's 20 years ago now, I recognized some of the patterns. I thought, don't do this to me. I was already responding in that don't NLP me way when I started learning, which I think gave me advantage in learning that material too. There are other things that are important as well. So very recently, I've done some reading up on this thing called highly sensitive traits. People have been telling me you should read about this for a long time, and I've just completely blanked the whole concept. I know about sensitive people. I'm not interested in sensitive people. That's not where my attention is. My attention is on people with less peoply traits, was what I was thinking. But what it turned out was this thing called highly sensitive people is not people who are terribly sensitive to other people's emotions and great empaths. Highly sensitive traits, in the way that that is currently used in some circles, means people who are very aware of environmental stimuli and process it in a slightly different way to some people. So just as people on the autistic spectrum are often very sensitive to environmental stimuli, people with highly sensitive traits are very sensitive to environmental stimuli and then take them in and think deeply about them and make connections between the things they hear and see. Highly sensitive trait people find it difficult to be in crowds of people, particularly crowds of people who are talking loudly for a long time, and especially when people are trying to talk at them a lot. So as of this week, I'm starting to identify with this trait of highly sensitive traits, and thinking, maybe that might be me, but if I'd known that 50 years ago, would I have had a different life? And I would have. So I'm very happy with not having known.
You've opened up so many loops that I want to explore here. The last one there particularly, I've also had a similar journey. A few years ago, I started to recognize that I struggled with high noise environments, particularly different types of communication. So multiple conversations running simultaneously, I get discombobulated. And it turns out I thought I had hearing problems. I've actually got extremely good hearing, possibly even too good. But I cope with certain noise and certain multiple stimuli. So I have to use earphones and earplugs and those sorts of things, busy, noisy environments. I tend to shy away from them. Perhaps this was without knowing it, it guided me to go and work in the most remote parts of the planet where there's really nobody. I've spent most of my career in Antarctica, getting away from the crowds and the cities. And it changed the way that I learn, and it changed the way that I listen and communicate, realizing that I've got an acute sensory ability in hearing, and I almost don't hear in the same way that a lot of people do. I find it hard to process sometimes. So I understand that. And I also have a similar trait, and I'll put it in my words now, which is I have an allergic reaction to hypnotic patterns. When people use them around me and they use the hypnotic patterns, I go, I recognize this pattern. I don't be using that on me. Don't be NLPing me, or don't be hypnotizing me, So I've got a couple of sensitivities. I think you might resonate with that.
Yes, and sorry for listeners. Yes, and is one of the most common and most annoying hypnotic language patterns. It does work. It works absolutely reliably compared to yes, but. It's brilliant. But as soon as you hear someone say yes, and instead of yes, but, well, the hairs go up on my finger on the back of my hands. Back of my hands, back of my wrists, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Now I want to ask you about Antarctica, but you're supposed to be interviewing me. One thing I want to mention is, in this Away Days thing, we were doing an activity that a lot of people will have done called User Manual for Me, where everybody creates a manual for how they would like other people to interact with them. You can look it up. It's a relatively straightforward thing to Google. The user manual for me. And one lady had written in her user manual that she'd become much more sensitive to noise in the office since COVID.
Mm.
And I think that might be a relatively common pattern, that before she was very comfortable in the office, liked the buzz of people around her. Then she spent nearly 2 years working from home. Now she's gone back to the office, and it's driving her nuts.
Well, I think that's something else to look out for. I think you're right. I know that there's a lot of people struggling with symptoms around long COVID, and there's all sorts of a spectrum, from sensitivities to sound, to certain foods, to light, chronic pain, issues thinking, cloudiness is something that's often reported. And I think we need to accommodate those in the way that we work, both face-to-face in the real and as well as virtual.
Yeah, I think, are people becoming more sensitive to themselves and what they need and what they prefer? Or has it changed what they need and what they prefer? There's going to be an interplay of both of those things. And I think that one of the things that needs to happen in the current time period is, well, obviously I wasn't there post Second World War, but what I know from hearing about it is that I think people were relatively patient with people's eccentricities and differences. They were happy to say, oh, that's just Fred. That's just his idiosyncrasy. We work round it. And of course, that was easier in those days because people were in more stable environments, more stable jobs. There wasn't the expectation that you would be meeting dozens of people every week, talking to new people, going to new places, interacting with huge numbers of people online. We had a more limited scope to what was expected of people. So I'm curious about how we're going to handle all of that right now. I'm actually writing a course about this at the moment, which I think is going to be something a lot of people will be interested in, which is how do we deal with the enormous overwhelm of emails and online meetings? People like the autonomy of working from home, but they hate the fact they are expected to be in meetings from morning till night and then do thousands of emails. And what I learned recently from some stuff in Cal Newport's book, The End of Email, is that you can understand this mathematically, that online meetings expand to fill the time available. There's no friction to calling an online meeting. The friction is it takes effort to create a good online meeting, and it takes effort to attend an online meeting, but there's no friction at all to call it and invite as many people as you like. Similarly, there's no friction to send an email, to just dash off a quick email and reply all. But there's friction, there's work involved in replying to an email. There's work even in reading the subject line and hitting delete, reading the subject line and deciding whether to open it or it's spam. There's a lot of work in stopping what you were previously doing, carefully reading the email that somebody sent you, and then sending a considered reply point by point. Now imagine the frustration if you've done that considered reply thing, and that only then you realise that they didn't intend to send it to you. You should have been CC'd. You weren't actually being asked for your opinion. You were only being looped in for information. It's infuriating. Sorry, I've gone off on a rant.
No, you've actually jumped ahead to one of the questions I was going to ask you for a solution. A central thing that I'm finding particularly in the frontline agencies that I'm working with, they are overwhelmed by emails, by meetings, and so much so that now their corporate communications are being ignored. And not by a proportion of people, by almost everybody. I've been in a situation very recently with a big agency 15,000 people. Something comes out from the head of the agency and literally nobody's read it. When I ask people, I go around and say, did you read that? No, I didn't. No, I never read any of those. None. And then you go, well, hang on a minute. At what level are you reading emails? Is there a chain up there? And sometimes they'll read things from the direct line manager. More importantly, largely not. There's so many channels now all working simultaneously.
And there's just too much of it.
I agree. There is simply too much. And it's not salient. I mean, this is called the Salience Podcast because I wanted to provide things that were useful to people. If I can't find 3 things from what we say today that are going to be useful for people, we won't publish it. And I know we've already found 3 things that are useful. I'll summarize those at the end. But this is the point. How do we cut through the noise and find out some useful stuff on a range of topics? We know what the topic is, what's going to be useful here for a wide range of people. How do we make things salient? How do we cut through and go, look, there's a bunch of background here, but here's actually what you need to know right now. I want to structure a question for you. I want to know about the online meetings and the online gatherings that you've developed this sort of niche expertise in. And I want to know, what do you do before, then during, and then after to make those meetings meaningful, salient, and just absolutely knock out that tagline that you've got, better than in person.
For more of the people, for more of the time.
Yeah.
We don't claim that it's universally better. It definitely isn't. There are some things where in person is better. But the great thing about looking at it in the way you framed it, what happens before, what happens after, and what happens during, is it's not enough to focus on what happens during. It's really, really important to focus on what happens during, because it's expensive to run a meeting. If it's an internal meeting, you're paying everybody's salaries for being there. If it involves external people, then your reputation is on the line. It's really important to get the stuff that happens during the meeting really high value. So top tips there. Absolutely limit any talks to 10 minutes or less unless your speaker is extraordinarily experienced. If you're just asking somebody from the organisation to give a quick input, 10 minutes or less. And make sure that any speaker can see the audience. Find a way of making it so your speaker can see the people, or at least some of the people they're speaking to, because otherwise they will be boring. They'll repeat themselves and they'll get, it won't go well. So break it up and then make sure there are lots of activities in which people can participate. And what those activities are depend on what kind of meeting and all those kinds of things. I'm a heavy user of breakout rooms, but I use them really short and really small. So under 5 minutes, under 3 people typically, with a really tight question to discuss. Get the buzz going by doing that kind of thing. And make sure that by the end of the session, there's real concrete output. And that relates to what needs to happen before. What needs to happen before is you need to be absolutely crystal clear about what you're doing this for. That means you need to invite exactly the right people. Not everyone you can think of who might be interested, just the right people. The smaller the online meeting, the more it will get the stuff done. And if you can make sure that the people who are coming know why they're coming, you've got an extra bonus. Then you want to start the conversation before the event. And this is where tools other than email are really, really important. Email is rubbish at pre-event conversation because everything's in reply all. And who's got time to read reply all threads? It just isn't going to happen. So somehow you need to find the right tools to get people engaging with each other and with the agenda and with any preparation before you start. Now, not everybody will do that. Not everybody will engage beforehand. Not everybody will read the preparation or whatever it is. But some people really need that in order to engage at all. They want to read up, they want to understand what's being discussed, and they want to reflect. We were talking earlier about different people's ways of being in the world. There are people who need to read and reflect to be able to engage in a conversation. You absolutely need to warn your participants that they are expected to engage, that this is not a thing where people are just going to sit back and listen. They are expected to participate, because people have been trained into just sitting there, or more likely cracking on with doing something else while listening to a webinar, as if it was the radio in the background. Well, that's fine if that's the kind of event you're doing. But if you're doing an event in which you need people to have conversations and join in, they need to be warned ahead of time. I feel like I've done another rant.
No, not at all. I just had a little brief moment of internal dialogue there, which was, oh my, there's way more than 3 salient points here that I'm going to have to summarize. I'd like you to continue.
Salient point. Judy's writing an online course with all of this stuff in it.
No, I need you to rant a little bit more. I want you to tell me more about after the meeting. We've got some great stuff about before. Crystal clear what we're doing this for. The right people, smaller numbers will get more done. During, make it exceptional and high value. Limit keynotes to less than 10 minutes of talking, unless they're extraordinary. I like this idea of breaking up in lots of activities, and we do this too, but you're even tighter. We go to a maximum of 7 minutes for a breakout, but you're down to 5. 3 people, real concrete. Here's your question. This is what we want to get out of it. That's what I've taken away. And I'd like to know then, okay, we've closed the meeting. We said, thanks, everybody. Are there any tips and tricks for that after the meeting to really bring that value and bring it home?
Well, let's wind back a little bit. I mentioned in passing this idea of clean language, and one of the books that I co-authored is Clean Language, Revealing Metaphors and Opening Minds. And clean language is a precision inquiry technique for understanding how other people are thinking, or what other people are thinking, and clarifying all sorts of things. And behind clean language stands, you've done an interview with Caitlin Walker, haven't you? So in the podcast sequence, you can find Caitlin Walker talking about clean language and associated topics. So the clean language approach, one of its fundamental assumptions is that what matters is what's going on inside the other person's system, inside their head, inside their body. I can't know with any degree of precision what's happening inside them, but that's what makes them do what they do. So to my mind, what needs to happen before or during the event is something needs to happen inside the other person that determines what they're going to do afterwards. So for someone listening to this podcast, what matters is that, as the saying goes, a penny drops inside their system. And as that penny drops, various cogs whir, and it turns into something front of mind that's going to actually get done. So one of the things that I think is absolutely crucial to make after action happen is that individuals who are participating in the event or the meeting or the call need to make their own decisions about what they are going to do. And then, as you know, from the hypnotic stuff, one of the things that makes people much more likely to do what they think they're going to do is to say it out loud, write it down, and share it with other people. Now, depending on the context, if it's a public event or a public podcast like that, I'm not in any way in control of what anyone's going to do with this information. It's not my thing. But if I'm doing an internal organizational thing, I'll also support that individual action with, if it's a team thing, team-wide action. And that means that the team leader, the team administrator need to have a grip of the right kind of tools to support after event action. Now, that might, in a lot of organizations, mean Microsoft Teams in terms of Teams chat channels, shared documents based on SharePoint, those kinds of things, so that people can keep track. Well, did that happen? Did that happen? Did that happen? We internally to ReesMcCann, we use Trello boards to keep track of our tasks. But what we shouldn't be doing is adding to that email overload by having the departmental administrator having to email everybody to say, did you do that? No, that's not the way it works. We need somehow to have shared checklists so that status can be quickly and easily shared, quickly and easily checked asynchronously when we're not all together again.
Fantastic. So if I paraphrase a little bit, what you're saying is we're looking to activate individuals during the meeting where there's the penny drops, there's a light bulb moment, it's a aha. And they recognize that there are things that they're going to do from the meeting. And I really like the summary when you said, say it out loud, write it down, share it. And then you went into the tools of how to share it and collaborate. And you mentioned a number of software apps that allow us to do that. And I took away that it's really important that when we've got the actions that people in their own time can tap in and out and work out, what have I done? What did other people say they're doing? And how does this fit together as part of the whole? We have a meeting. I have a little meeting template. We have a bit of a play on words. We call it the pissed off meeting template, because so many people say that I'm pissed off with all these meetings. And we have this as an acronym, and it starts with the pre-meeting and it ends up with actions and what's going to happen in the future. And we talk about what are you going to do, who's going to do it, for whom, and by when. So there's a little checklist. You can't have, and again, I learned this from a hypnotic pattern that I used to hear in some executive meetings when I worked in government. A lot of meetings would end with the words, we're all going to. And it was like, I'm not going to do a damn thing. I've not got anything in my book that I'm doing. What do you mean we're all going to? It's pure hypnotic nonsense. And occasionally I'd call this up and say, please, can I interrupt? I'm very sorry. I don't have anything to do. And they'd look at me like I was an alien. I'd say, I have no tasks. Who is doing what? Going to be delivered by whom to who? We've just spent 2 hours here and $20,000 of executive time. I don't have anything to do. I wasn't destined to last in government very long, I suspect.
Well, one of the interesting things that I'm noticing, maybe because ReesMcCann is now associated with 2 other consultancies, Impact Basis and Basis. And Basis is a consultancy whose job is introducing agile methodologies. Well, this is one of the things they do, introducing agile methodologies to government within the UK. Often local government, councils, local authorities. And that idea of an agile methodology, or even thinking about the work methodology, the workflow, is so completely new to many people in the public sector, and indeed to the voluntary sector and to the non-governmental sector. It's really only the software world and certain emergency services, hospitals perhaps, where people are using processes and checklists to get the work done, making sure that things are broken into tasks being done by people, for who, by when, and that process is replicable. It might be that every person showing up to the accident and emergency department of a hospital is unique and special. It certainly is, and their case is unique and special. But you can still say there's a process for bringing this person into the hospital and deciding what needs to happen next. And that kind of process-driven thinking needs to happen in order to reduce the email overload. Cal Newport talks about a hyperactive hive mind workflow, where everybody is asked to be involved in everything all the time. And I think I can certainly recognize that as being a thing that happens in a lot of places. it happens because people don't want to exclude people. People don't want to, and also people don't want to take responsibility for making decisions themselves. So they want everybody involved in everything all the time. But everybody involved in everything all the time produces this huge email overload and this huge meeting overload. We need to pay attention to process and to workflow in order to get some of these critical jobs that absolutely need to be done. We need to get them done better.
Yeah, you've just triggered a thought and a link, and it for me, and it relates to what you said about calling an online meeting is frictionless, and I think that too often kicking off a project when you're in an executive level is frictionless. It's like, yeah, let's do that project. Let's do that project. Now, when they're actually doing the projects, there's too much friction. But actually kicking them off is frictionless. And I'm reminded of two things. One was a meme I saw on LinkedIn, and it was an image of a toilet roll with just the holder in the middle, the little bit of cardboard, and one little scrap of toilet paper hanging off, and it said, "Remember to resource your projects before you start." And it reminded me of another story from a friend of mine who's a portfolio manager. He does agile in banks. He did a review in a major bank, and he looked at all of their projects right across their portfolio, and he said, you need to kill 85% of your projects. They are under-resourced. They're not got a relevance to the business. They're not going to deliver benefit. They don't have a sponsor. No one cares enough about them to really deliver them. You need to kill 85%. So the 15% of things that must happen now and are mission critical, get done on time, on spec, cut this stuff back out, change your systems. Yes, have frictionless when you've chosen to do something, make it happen, but don't make it frictionless. These are my words now, paraphrasing from what you've said. And I think there's that link there between the virtual meetings. And I think that's a major problem. And I've just made that link now to what's going on. So thank you. I find that really, really useful there.
I love that link, and I'd like to build on that link, which is inside a meeting, it's pretty frictionless to say, let's all, whatever it is, let's all, because you sort of commit to doing it yourself, but you've also just committed everybody else to doing it, except they're not committed. And you can say it, so it makes you feel okay. Oh, we're all going to do that now. It's going to be fine. But nobody else is committed to doing it.
Yeah, you've just triggered another thought there, another cascade. I mean, some conversations recently about accountability and responsibility, and particularly in meetings and with leaders. I'm encouraging leaders to. What's often happening is that there's almost like a hidden devolution of accountability down, and people don't even know that they're responsible for it until something goes wrong. And what I'm saying is you need to do the opposite. If you're a leader, you need to be accountable, and you need to retain the accountability, and you need to delegate the responsibility. And you need to do it in such a way that the risk is covered, because ultimately you need to own the risk. And I think that's critical for these meetings, for these gatherings. We've got some friction in there. We've got some accountability. It's got some of the who, the what, the why. But we need to be clear on this. What are you responsible for, and how does it fit in? And when it comes to the risk, if I'm the leader or the chair of this meeting, or if I'm the host or the facilitator, what's my accountability now for the whole of this? And I think that adds another dimension.
Indeed. We could go down very deep down this rabbit hole.
Yeah. I think what we're starting to do is we're starting to think about, I'm thinking about, where am I tracking? What am I tracking for in a meeting? What's salient? What's relevant for me? What are the actions that I'm taking? What are other people saying they're doing? And most importantly, how does it all fit together? Is there anything else in meetings that you've got your attention on? Whether it's people falling asleep or nonverbals, what could it be? Where's your attention in meetings?
Typically, the thing that I'm mostly tracking for is engagement, is checking who's acted in the meeting, who's spoken, who's contributed something in the chat, who's turned their camera off. Turning your camera off is a really interesting gesture. Have you read the book Because Internet by Gretchen somebody or other? I've forgotten the surname. But there are a couple of really interesting books out there at the moment about digital body language, of various meanings of digital body language, and how people interpret what people do on the internet in some very interesting ways. And interesting asides like gesture, when you're in person, you can look at the use of emojis and see that it's actually replacing physical gesture in text. They can relate the two things in corpuses of knowledge, and they can see that where you would normally go with your hand and a repeated gesture, people are putting repeated emojis and that kind. So I've digressed and lost my point, but the thing is that when people turn off their cameras, the meaning people make is often that person has disengaged and is doing their email. Now, that may or may not be true, but that is a very commonly made assumption. That has some implications. One of them I mentioned earlier. So if your speaker can't see any people, they'll assume nobody's listening. And that makes it really difficult for most people to keep talking. That's why podcasts work well as an interview rather than one person talking to the microphone. Because you need that feedback to keep you interested. Another thing that is interesting about that is that women and people in lower income countries are much more likely to turn off their cameras for all of the reasons you can imagine. So what is that doing to what people think about those people and how people think about those people? Because another thing you can notice when you do a lot of these online meetings and you pay attention to it is that the people whose cameras are turned off, if you let the group determine who's going to speak next, and you say everybody's got to speak, you're going to throw the virtual ball around the room and everybody's going to speak, the people with cameras off are always called last. Now, when we start to think about hybrid meetings, that has implications as well, because the people in the room are bigger and more present, and so the people remote are likely to be forgotten or called last and those kind of things. But just thinking about online meetings, turning off your camera is not trivial. It's going to have a real impact.
There's so much that's fascinating there. And the most fascinating aspect of what you said was almost what you didn't say. You go to metaphors and symbols. You go to your strength and your rich history. That's what you're looking for there. You're seeing the symbolism in the camera, in the emojis, in the engagement. And I think that's fascinating itself. And I think you're absolutely right. It's telling you at the heart of thinking what's going on here as it's represented in the metaphors and symbols. I think it's beautiful.
And the meaning making. So
yeah.
This, and go back to the Caitlin thing to talk about meaning making. But it's not about what the person turning off their camera meant. It's the meaning that the other people made of it.
Yeah. I did an online workshop last week, 90 minutes for some very senior leaders. And it was the first opening part of this new program. It's a novel way of delivering leadership. It's got an online platform in behind it with all the resources, and it's peer led. And my guest was the deputy secretary of this department. I don't know the size of his portfolio, but it's like $1 billion. It's enormous. And he gave 90 minutes of his time to participate in this for the senior executive team. And the feedback was that it was an incredible gift that he took so much time out to spend 90 minutes helping them in their leadership journey. And we went through some rapport. We did a quick rapport breakout. And then we did, when you're learning at your best, because the topic was learning to lead.
Mm-hmm.
When you're learning at your best, and I interviewed him really quickly, like 3 minutes, and he said, I need to make notes. And he said, when you see me making notes, and he explained the meaning of making notes. And this is so valuable, because when people see him making notes, they might think he's doing something else. But in fact, he's paying them great service, because he's looking at them and he's listening and he's making notes and he's synthesizing and he's learning from what they've said. So what a powerful way of getting people to appreciate what you're doing. And suddenly they're understanding the symbolism of what I'm doing right now. And his answers were immaculate. There were so many clever things. And he'd often say, there are 3 things that I do, and it's this, and it's this, and it's this. And just the way he delivered, it was so much gold in there. But I thought I'd share that, because again, there's that symbolism, and it brought a lot of value, and people recognized something in there that they took away, some sort of value.
I love that story for a whole bunch of reasons. In the group that I was recently working with, there was a misunderstanding because one person wanted to have their laptop with them in every meeting. And in fact, they were taking notes about the meeting. Everybody had assumed that they were just doing their email.
Absolutely. This is very nuanced. There's so much here. We've got some stuff that's now explicit. We've got a lot of things that are built over many years of experience, the appreciation of symbols and metaphors and language patterns. And I've got this is both a metaphor and a filter. I've been asking this question for a few podcasts, and I've got a couple more to go. And the question is, if you wanted to grow ReesMcCann and you were interviewing for your company to do this sort of work, and you could only ask one question, what would you ask at interview?
I saw this question in your preparation email, and I nearly said, don't ask me that, because I don't think I can't relate to the situation. Because I can't think of any situation in which I would get into that I look at recruitment processes where there is a fixed list of questions, and I think, how do they do that? How on earth do they manage to recruit with a fixed list of questions that don't respond to the person in front of them? But then I haven't got the beautifully crafted question yet. But where I would be going was something back in the day. It's a long time ago. The last time I was actively recruiting for a role, and I used to routinely have to actively recruit for the role of duty editor at Teletext. Long story, but I used to say the critical thing we need to find out is what happens when they don't know. So I suppose that's the question. What happens when you don't know?
Yeah, fantastic.
So in that role, it was really important that they took an attitude of deep curiosity. And that's also true in the work that I do now. Headline words tend to be curiosity and kindness. If we can approach the world with an attitude of curiosity and kindness, a whole lot of other things will fall into place. But when we're overwhelmed, both of those things tend to disappear. So that would be my question. What happens when you don't know?
Again, despite you saying that you didn't have one, you have a very well thought through, penetrative question that gets to a heart of a particular set of behaviors that you might want to know about, particularly if somebody's going to bluff their way through it or make stuff up or wish to appear that they do know. We talk about, in complexity, I use a lot of the Cynefin framework. And in the middle of Cynefin is the confused domain. And there are 2 types of confused. There's a type of confused when you know that you're confused. And that's a good place to be. You go, I don't know. I'm going to go and find out. I'm going to be curious. I wonder what type of system I'm in. I wonder what I need to do. The other type of confused is when you don't know that you're confused. And they're the sort of people that you're trying to avoid. So are we.
Absolutely.
So,
and of course that curiosity, that don't knowness, extends into other domains of Cynefin as well. But and often where I'm working is in the complex. A lot of us are working a lot of the time in the complex now. That's how it is. And an attitude of curiosity. What happens if is really important there. If in other there must be domains in which things are simple or complicated, but a lot of the work both of us do and a lot of the listeners will do will simply be complex.
Absolutely. And particularly in the coaching and the training domain and the sorts of work that we do, it's entirely complex. You begin with something, and this actually, you gave a complex answer to my simple question, which was, well, it depends, because it, the person, the place, the job, there's so many different things. I can't stick to a scripted set of questions, and I don't know how government do it. And you're right. However, armed with a range of questions that that you can adapt, that can make things easy. I mean, clean language questions are a fantastic way to start, of course, putting some of those in. And I agree that this sense of curiosity is the way to think about those complex issues. Be curious. What's going on? Look for patterns. Look for change. Look for difference. Look for what you think is going to happen, and then go, I wonder if there's something that's not the way I think it should be. What a magnificent filter that is. And as we're broadening here, I've got one final question, and it relates to curiosity. And that is, if you could direct people's attention to something important in the world, what would it be?
Can I say curiosity?
Absolutely.
I just think being curious is just such an interesting thing. Where placing a value on curiosity, and I used to apologize for my curiosity. I used to say, I'm sorry I'm so nosy, but I really, really want to know how this works. But nowadays I start to think, actually, we need curiosity. It's important. If we don't have curiosity, nothing's going to happen to improve our situation, to connect us more interestingly, to get stuff done. We need curiosity. But and that means we need to create the conditions for curiosity to be possible. And the conditions of overwhelm are not conditions where curiosity is easy.
Yeah, that is a fantastic place to end this podcast. Conditions of overwhelm are not conducive to curiosity. And I agree that if we can take curiosity into the world and we start to question, I think a lot of the things that we accept that are not working, but we keep doing them anyway, over and over and over again, will stop, because people will say, I've been curious about this and I'm asking questions, and this does not seem to be working. Everything from mental health, climate change, capitalism as it runs now. There are so many things that you look at them and you go, I'm curious about this, but I'm actually terrified because they're clearly not working. And what can we do about that? I've got far more to take away from this podcast than I can summarize in 3 salient points. I'm going to do my very best.
Go for it.
I think the first thing I take away is that there's much more to an online meeting than just the meeting. There's an enormous amount of thinking and preparation that goes in before we set the meeting up, and then there's the expectations and the systems and the supports afterwards. I think that the meetings are, I don't know if fractal is the right word, but there are things that are happening with meetings globally that are also happening with the way that we do projects, the way that we engage with the world, with our resources, with our attention. And you talked about frictionless, and I think there's not enough friction in some places and there's too much friction in others. And I think a redistribution of friction is needed for combating this overwhelm and getting to the salient points, the things that are important in the world. And I think I'm going to end with this notion that we should all be more curious. And that's my salient summary, 3 dot points.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you, Judy. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.